Well, welcome to worship on this 4th of July weekend. You will notice that worship is very abbreviated today. It's actually just the sermon. We're hoping to have worship outside at Incarnation today, and it would be very difficult to do the whole live stream piece. But we did want to give you a sense at least of how we continued our theme of questions that God asks us. So that's what we're living into today. And the question today is, what is your name? And it comes from Genesis 32. It's this fantastic little story about Jacob wrestling this demon or this man or this angel or God, whomever this person is that Jacob wrestles with. And actually, as I was reading through it the first time, one of the things I remembered was when I was a kid, I continually watched, I think it was on Saturday nights, a show called All-Star Wrestling. And it's in Minnesota, and I remember figures like Vern Gagne and the Gagne Sleeper, and I remember Andre the Giant and Billy Superstar Graham. And what I would do is that I was watching it in my bedroom, and I had a bed, and I had a panda bear that was about this big, stuffed panda bear, and I would emulate all of the different moves that they were doing on the screen. The beauty of all of that was this: I never got hurt, and I always won. I never got hurt, and I always won in those wrestling matches. We're going to look at a wrestling match today where through struggle and through pain and through getting hurt, there ended up being a sense of promise and new life for Jacob. So that's going to take us back to Genesis 32. Let me set up the story itself. So Jacob's grandparents were Abraham and Sarah from Genesis 12. They were the forerunners of the faith for the people. They left their home. They were blessed to be a blessing to all nations. One of their sons was named Isaac. Isaac married Rebekah. And Isaac and Rebekah had Jacob and Esau, had twins. And Jacob and Esau, it even said that even in the womb, Rebekah understood that there was going to be conflict between the two of them. They would be wrestling around with each other. Esau was born first. And Jacob even came out holding on to Esau's heel. It's a fanciful little story, but it gives you a sense of the competition between the two of them right from the very beginning. Now, what happens during their lifetime is that Jacob, who's the younger one, ends up doing two things. One, he steals the birthright, and then he also tricks his father out of the blessing. So what are those things? Well, the blessing is the thing that's passed on from generation to generation, and it can't be given to somebody else. And so when Jacob went in and he dressed himself up like his brother Esau, his father was blind. He must have manipulated his voice. It's this crazy little story that they put together. He somehow tricked his dad into thinking that he was his brother Esau, and he received the blessing, the family blessing. What was the birthright? The birthright was basically boiled down to what they might call the double portion. So if you were the oldest son, and there was another son, so in this case, Jacob and Esau. Esau was the firstborn, and so Esau would get what they called a double portion, and which means that he got twice as much inheritance than Jacob. So during his lifetime, Jacob both tricked his brother Esau out of his birthright, and he also fooled his father into giving him the blessing. And what happened is that Esau became so enraged that when he found out that Jacob had done this, that he wanted to kill his brother. So Jacob figures this out, the plot out, and he flees into another land. He ends up staying with an uncle of his for almost 20 years, about 2 decades or so. And it wasn't until that point that they start making their way back to each other. So in this story, in Genesis 32, what's happening is that Jacob is coming back. Esau is planning on meeting him. Jacob has heard that Esau is coming with just a multitude of armies and a massive force, it feels like. And Jacob is absolutely worried, as he should be. So as he's preparing to meet his brother the next morning, Jacob has this experience in the night. And let me walk you through it. The same night, Jacob got up and he took his 2 wives and his maids and his 11 children, and he crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. There a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Wrestled with him in the night. I don't think it's too obvious to say that hard things happen in the night, don't they? Hard things happen in the night. Think about if we're feeling any sense of guilt, how that is just exaggerated if we wake up in the middle of the night. If we have any sense of regret or loss, it feels just so overwhelming in the middle of the night. If we have this sense that we haven't done the right things in our lives, it just gets so overwhelming in the middle of the night. So there Jacob is. It's in the middle of the night. He's wrestling. Now, is it a man? Is it an angel? Is it God? Is he wrestling with himself? Yeah, it could be some of each. And yet there it is in the middle of the night. The hard parts of wrestling with ourselves. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said to him, "I will not let you go until you bless me," which is really fascinating, isn't it? Because Jacob had already received the blessing from his father. What more was he trying to get? I'm wondering if there's some part of who Jacob is that says, I didn't get this on the best terms or even the right terms. And there's something about me that has to feel like something outside of myself has to still bless me, to honor me, even though I'd spent my whole life being this person who lived with this deception. So the person said to him, or the man or the angel or God said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "What? Jacob." And then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." That's the focus we're going to look at in a little bit. Jacob's name was Jacob, and it was changed in this story to Israel. Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask me my name?" And there he extended a blessing to him. So Jacob called that place Peniel, saying, "I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to that day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. So let's go back for a second. I want to take you back to that whole question, what is your name? Jacob's name literally meant the one who supplants, or the one who overreaches, or in this case, the one who deceives. Think about that for a sense of identity, right? In biblical times, your name said something about who you are. It said something about your identity. And here's this Jacob, this person who has spent his whole life, his whole identity as an adult, being one who supplants, being one who deceives. He lived his whole life, adult life, in a lie. In that wrestling, there was a pivot, there was a change of the name, and it went from Jacob to Israel, and Israel means the one who struggles with God, the one who wrestles with God. And somehow in the middle of that, there was something new and vital that could happen for Jacob's life. He was able to release his sense of identity as a person who deceives, and he was transformed into a person who's willing to have that struggle with God and move forward, even through the pain of it. So when God asks, or the angel asks, "What is your name?" it simply means, who are you? What's your identity? So let me flip the question for us today. What's your name? Who are you? Who do you long to be? It's interesting. My name is Kai, and it's a Scandinavian name, and it was given to me at birth, Scandinavian heritage, and its Scandinavian roots mean dock or pier, something that the boats get tied up to. In Greek, Kai means and or but. It's a conjunction. In Hawaiian, Kai means ocean, which I love. So actually, when people ask me what my name is, and I say Kai, and they say, "What's your background?" and I say, "I'm Hawaiian." And nobody believes me. But there's something beautiful just about that sense of identity that I love, that ocean. It says something about who you are. So, back to you. Back to you. What's your name? Who are you? Who do you long to be? One of the things I think is critical in this story is that who are you and your identity can be transformed. And you can become something more than what you thought of yourself at one time. That's the hopeful piece of this particular story. So who are you? And who do you want to be? So it's the 4th of July weekend in the context of our country, which means that we celebrate our identity, right? We celebrate who we are as American people. Is it an understatement in any way to say that we're struggling with that right now? We're struggling with what that might mean. We're struggling with how we can see each other as people who live such divergent ways of existence, yet are part of the same community. What does that mean for us today? Let me ask this question. So if you were going to describe yourself, just put characteristics of who you are out there, how would you line them up? Would you say your name? Would you say maybe the place you work? I'm part of this family. I'm an American. I'm also a follower of Jesus. ... So would you say I'm an American first or a follower of Jesus? Just to use those two categories. I think that matters. I actually think that matters. I believe this. If we say and if we experience our first identity as people who are Americans, even before who we are as a person of God, a follower of Jesus, then what happens is that our primary identity is shaped around things that are part of the American experience. So in some ways what happens is that we baptize these things that are important to us as Americans. So we say democracy is of God, or we would say capitalism is of God, or we would say even that sense of competition that makes us who we are as Americans is of God. And so that becomes the shaper of our identity. I'm going to invite you to struggle with that today, to wrestle with that just a little bit. Because my sense is what I'd like you to wrestle with, and what I have to keep wrestling with in the context of our culture, is what's the core part of our identity and how does that live itself out in the rest of our lives? So if we begin with, rather than I happen to be an American and I also follow Jesus, etc., or we flip that and we say, my primary identity is a follower of Jesus and I happen to live in the United States, I'm just going to suggest today that takes on a very different shape. It takes on a very different vision. To start with who we are as Jesus people means that what we want to be able to do then is to emulate that life of Jesus in whatever way that we can. And so we look into the life of Jesus and we say, Jesus was one who said, I want to be able to bring good news to the poor. And so we say, is there a way for us to do that? Jesus gathered around table with tax collectors and sinners, and so brought people that wouldn't otherwise have a place at the table into community with him. Jesus forgave 70 times 7, which means you just keep doing it. Jesus said that there was one big commandment that we all need to flow out of, or two, to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, to love our neighbors as ourselves. And he said this in John 13, by this, everyone's going to know that you are my followers if you have love for one another. Which means this, that if we start with the identity of who we are as Jesus followers, then we take on those things that Jesus was in the best way that we can. We're going to fumble at it. We're going to fail at it. We take it on as best we can. And then we try to live that out in all the different parts of our lives, as who we are in our family, in our relationships, as who we are as citizens of this country, as who we are in community. I'm going to suggest today that if we begin to say that we've been baptized first into being a follower of Jesus, and that becomes our primary identity, it's probably going to cause us to have some just core struggles with how we live that out in this world. Let me just throw out a couple of them that I think are important for us to wrestle with at this time. I would say that our American culture at this point is a culture of an intense individualism. An intense individualism. You go back to one of our core struggles in this last couple of years with COVID around masks. And what did that reveal about us as a community? The response was, you can't make me do anything. I have the right to be able to do whatever I want to do. And so there were fights in airports, and there were complaints that people had, and there was skepticism that people had even looking at one another, because the core issue was, nobody can tell me what to do. This intense individualism of our culture. If you look at the scriptures and the life of Jesus, it has little to do with who we are as individuals, as much as it has to do as who are we going to be as a community and in relationship with one another. Paul actually talks about this beautifully. He says, uses the image of freedom, right? Freedom doesn't mean you can do whatever you want, whenever you want to, just because you are a person. Paul says it this way. Paul says, you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become servants of one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single command: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I guess I just want to put out there today that if we are going to find our core identity as people of Jesus first, then we're going to have to wrestle with what it means to live in a culture of intense individualism. Let me put out a couple more. If we find our core identity as a person of Jesus, as a follower of Jesus, we're going to have to wrestle hard with what it means to be a part of a culture of violence. On May 26th, I remember seeing this article because I went back to it. There was Amnesty International, just as a justice organization across the world, put out a travel warning for people to come to the United States because it was too violent. How crazy is that, huh? Or maybe not so much. Because what had just happened in May? One, there was the shooting in the supermarket in Buffalo. Two, not long after that, there was the shooting in the school in Uvalde, Texas. And all of a sudden, people around the world are saying, wait a second, we may not even want to go to that place because it's so violent. I saw recently that there was in a political primary in Missouri that one of the candidates actually shot a commercial of themselves going hunting for their opponents. Going hunting for their opponents. We live in a culture too often that glorifies violence and that is allowing and permissive of violence. I want us just to think for a second that it took us 30 years to sit down across the aisle and enact some restrictions on gun ownership. 30 years it took us to do that. The very basic work that most Americans agree with. We live in a culture of violence. Jesus, he was standing in front of Pilate. I just want to kind of help you think about the antithesis of this in regard to who he was. Said this to Pilate, and Pilate, remember, represents all of the power of Rome, all of the threat of Rome, all of the violence of Rome. And he said, my kingdom, my way in this world is not going to be like yours. Because if it was going to be that way, my followers would fight just like your people do. But my kingdom, my way in this world is not like that. I'm going to suggest, friends, if we're followers of Jesus first, if this is the core identity that we have, it's probably going to be really important for us to wrestle with what it means to be a part of a culture of violence. Last one, I think we could probably go on more, but let me throw out one more at least. We live in a culture that's fascinated, obsessed with money. Obsessed with money. Money gets you power. Money gets you privilege. Money gets position. You see the extreme distancing that's happening between those who have and those who don't have in this world. I think if we're Jesus people, we're going to have to wrestle with what that means in our world. Jesus himself had that great story where he talked with a young attorney, and the attorney said, "Hey, what do I do to attain eternal life? How do I participate more actively in this life of God?" And Jesus said, "Well, tell me about the law." And he said, "Hey, I follow the law. I do all these right things. I do the good things. I'm a good person." And Jesus said, "It seems like there's one thing that you still lack. You need to go sell all that you have and give it to the poor, and then you can be free to follow me." Because what Jesus must have sensed in this person was this intense attachment to his things. 1 out of 7 of Jesus' parables was about how we properly use our money and our possessions, and we don't use them to manipulate people, and we don't withdraw them just to gain advantage over somebody. We don't think that we're better than somebody else because we have more of them. We live honorably with the gifts that we have. And that doesn't mean whether we have or whether we don't have. It just simply means, what do we think about and how attached are we to those particular gifts? And I'm just going to suggest, in our culture, in a money culture, it's really important for us to wrestle with, as Jesus' people, what it means to live with a great divergence of how we think and use our money. That's a lot, isn't it? It is a lot. But the question comes back to, what's your name? What's your identity? Who are you going to be? The beautiful thing for me about this story of Jacob is that there was possibility and there was hope of transformation. There was movement. There was a way for us to see our lives in a different way, in a better, more whole, in a more striving way. It took some struggle, didn't it? There was pain that was involved in that particular incident with Jacob, and there is pain that's going to be involved in us understanding who we are as Jesus people in this world, but that's the invitation we've been given. That's the vision that Jesus has for us. I want to close with a couple of words from a theologian, Bruce Epperly, and he's done a lot of work and study around St. Francis, and St. Francis was one who lived an intensely simple life because he didn't want to be ground up by the attachments of this world. And he said this: "I believe that Francis's message is even more important in light of the most recent pandemic to remind us how ultimately connected we are to each other." And then he said this: "The paths of greed, consumerism, individualism, and nationalism endanger the planet and its people. We need to break down barriers of friend and stranger, citizen and immigrant, rich and poor, if we are to survive in this increasingly interdependent world. Nations need to see patriotism in terms of world loyalty, not just self-affirmation." Friends, that's, I think, being identified with the mind and the eyes of Christ. And I think that's something for us to struggle with this day. Amen.